have been a patient man my entire life. I learned patience from my mother, who raised 4 kids on a teacher's salary and never once raised her voice in a way that wasn't completely earned. I learned it from 22 years of working in landscape architecture, a field where you spend entire seasons waiting for things to grow, where you understand on a cellular level that the best results come from care and time and a willingness to let things develop at their own pace. I am not a man who reacts quickly. I am not a man who escalates. I am not, by any reasonable measure, a man who builds a concrete wall in his front yard and dares someone to come near it. But here is what I am. I am a man who, when pushed far enough, when pushed past the point where patience is a virtue and becomes instead a form of surrender, will respond with a precision and a thoroughness that makes very clear to everyone involved that they have made a significant error in judgment. And the woman who pushed me to that point, the woman who crossed from annoying into genuinely malicious on a Wednesday morning in June, with a chainsaw crew she had hired and my Hedges as her target, that woman learned this about me in a way she will not soon forget. Her name was Patricia Holbrook. She was the president of the Elmwood Grove HOA, and she had been making my life difficult since the first week I moved into my house on Sycamore Lane. But what she did that Wednesday morning in June was not difficult. It was not inconvenient. It was not a violation notice or a passive-aggressive note or an unexpected visit with a measuring tape. What she did that Wednesday morning in June was come onto my property and destroy 12 years of work that I had put into the ground with my own hands. And she did it while I was at work and could not stop her. And she did it believing that I would have no recourse and nowhere to turn and nothing I could do about it. She was wrong about all 3 of those things. Let me take you back to where this started, because you need to understand the Hedges before you can understand what their destruction meant, and you need to understand what their destruction meant before you can understand what I built in their place. I moved to Sycamore Lane 11 years ago. I was 44 years old, recently divorced, in need of a project and a place, and the house at 22 Sycamore Lane gave me both. It was a solid house, good bones, as people say, meaning the structure was sound and everything wrong with it was fixable. What drew me to it more than the house, honestly, was the lot. It was a corner lot, wider than most in the neighborhood, with a generous strip of front yard that ran along both Sycamore Lane and the cross street, Maple Court. The previous owners had done nothing interesting with it. Standard grass, a couple of ornamental trees that had been neglected, and nothing along the property lines except a low rusted wire fence that barely kept its own shape. I knew immediately what I was going to do with it. I am a landscape architect. I have spent my career designing outdoor spaces, parks, corporate campuses, private estates, civic plazas. I know plants the way a carpenter knows wood. And what I saw in that corner lot was the potential for something I had always wanted to design for myself, but never had the space or the right situation to execute properly: a living boundary. A hedge system that would, over years of careful cultivation, become a genuine architectural element: tall, dense, sculpted, beautiful, and completely private. I chose American arborvitae for the primary structure. It is an excellent hedge plant, fast-growing relative to other evergreens, dense from ground to tip when properly managed, tolerant of our climate, and capable of reaching 15 to 20 feet in height when left to mature. I planned a double row along the Sycamore Lane frontage and a single row along the Maple Court side, with a gap at the driveway entrance that I would frame with 2 specimen plants on either side, shaped into formal columns. The whole installation was approximately 140 linear feet of hedge, requiring 68 individual trees at planting time. I planted them myself over 3 weekends in the spring of my first year at the house. I amended the soil. I installed an irrigation system. I staked the young trees against wind and mulched the bed heavily. I was not in a hurry. I understood that what I was planting would take years to become what I was imagining, and I was prepared to wait. I maintained those hedges for 11 years. Every year I shaped them with professional equipment. Every year I fertilized and monitored and adjusted the irrigation. Every year I watched them get taller, denser, more architectural, more exactly what I had envisioned when I put the first one in the ground. By year 5, They were a genuine visual presence on the street, green, full, about 8 feet tall, clearly sculpted and maintained. By year 8, they had become what I privately thought of as the defining feature of the street, the thing that made 22 Sycamore Lane visually distinct, that drew comments from passers-by and neighbors alike. By year 11, when all of this happened, the hedges along Sycamore Lane were 11 feet tall, the double row had knitted together into a single dense wall of green, and the specimen columns at the driveway entrance were, in my professional opinion, genuinely beautiful. They had taken 11 years to become what they were. Patricia Holbrook had been unhappy about them for approximately 4 of those 11 years. She moved into the neighborhood in my 7th year at the house. She bought a property 3 doors down on Sycamore Lane, and within 6 months of arriving, she had become the HOA president through a combination of persistence and the fact that the previous president had been delighted to hand the role to anyone willing to take it. She reorganized the HOA, updated the community guidelines, and began a systematic campaign of enforcement that the neighborhood had not previously experienced. I want to be fair here. Some of what she did was reasonable. There were genuine violations in the neighborhood, a house with peeling paint that had been ignored for years, a yard with accumulated debris that was genuinely becoming a problem. Patricia addressed those things, and I did not object. Rules exist for reasons, communities have legitimate interests, and a certain degree of HOA activity is part of what you sign up for when you buy in a governed community. My first violation notice arrived in my 7th year at the house, the same year Patricia moved in and took over the HOA. It said that my hedges were in violation of Section 6, Paragraph A of the Elmwood Grove Community Guidelines, which stated that front yard vegetation could not exceed 8 feet in height along street-facing property lines. My hedges at that point were approximately 9 feet tall on the Sycamore Lane side. I reviewed the guidelines. The 8-foot rule was real. I had read the guidelines when I moved in, but at that point my hedges had been 3 feet tall and the rule had felt irrelevant. I should have tracked it more carefully. I acknowledged this to myself, and I called the HOA management company to discuss the situation. What I explained to them, and what I documented in writing, was that the hedges were an established plantings that I had been cultivating for 7 years, that they had grown incrementally over that time, and that a hard cutback to 8 feet would require removing a significant portion of mature growth that would not recover aesthetically for several years. I proposed a trimming schedule that would gradually reduce the overall height to 8 feet over 2 growing seasons, a reasonable horticultural approach that would maintain the plant health while achieving compliance. I put this in writing. I sent it to the HOA management company. The management company responded that my proposal was under review. 3 months later, with no resolution and no further communication from the management company, I received a second notice from Patricia directly, not from the management company, from her personally, on HOA letterhead, reiterating the violation and adding that a fine schedule would begin if the hedges were not brought into compliance within 30 days. I called the management company again. I was told that my proposal had been received, but that the HOA president had determined it was not acceptable and that full compliance within 30 days was required. I trimmed the hedges to 8 feet. It took me a full weekend. It hurt, professionally and personally, to cut back growth that had taken years to achieve, but I did it. I documented the trimming with photographs and sent them to the management company with a written confirmation of compliance. Patricia sent me a compliance confirmation. Curt 2 sentences, but it was there. What I did not know at the time was that 8 feet was going to be a moving target. The following year, I received a notice that my hedges were in violation of a newly added provision to the community guidelines, one that had been voted in at an HOA meeting I had not attended, having not received notice of it, which was a whole separate problem that restricted front yard vegetation to 6 feet in height on corner lots, citing sightline concerns for drivers at intersections. My lot was a corner lot. My hedges were 8 feet. I was now 2 feet out of compliance again, through a rule change I had not been informed of. I raised the issue of the notice failure with the management company. They acknowledged that the meeting notice had not been sent to all homeowners, which was an administrative error on their part, and they offered an extended compliance window of 90 days rather than 30. I trimmed the hedges to 6 feet. This time it was worse than the first time because the growth I was removing was more substantial and the shape I was cutting into was not the shape I had designed. Arborvitae pruned below their natural taper looked truncated, blunted. The columns at my driveway entrance, which had been genuinely elegant at their natural height, looked squat. I was not happy about it, but I was in compliance. Patricia sent me another compliance confirmation. This one, I noticed, included a note at the bottom that said the HOA appreciated my cooperation with community standards. The phrasing made me feel, for reasons I could not fully articulate, that I was being managed. For 2 years after that, things were relatively quiet. I maintained the hedges at 6 feet. I attended HOA meetings. I paid my dues. I kept my property in good order in every respect. Patricia continued running the HOA with the same aggressive energy she had brought to it from the beginning, but for 2 years she left me more or less alone. And then came the spring of the 11th year. The Elmwood Grove HOA guidelines, I should explain, were not a static document. Patricia had amended them repeatedly since taking office, always through the proper vote process, always with at least the technical minimum of notice to homeowners, but with a frequency and a specificity that suggested the amendments were not primarily about community standards in the abstract. They were about particular properties, particular homeowners, particular situations that Patricia found objectionable. In April of my 11th year, the guidelines were amended again. This time, the amendment addressed what it called ornamental vegetation boundaries. The new provision stated that front yard vegetation along street-facing property lines was limited to 4 feet in height, and that the vegetation must be permeable, meaning that a vehicle or pedestrian standing on the sidewalk must be able to see through the vegetation to the property beyond at any point along its length. Solid hedges, regardless of height, were listed as non-compliant. 4 feet permeable. My hedges at that point were 6 feet tall and solid, not 4 feet and permeable, not anything close to 4 feet and permeable. They were 11-year-old established arborvitae, dense and full and green, and no version of pruning or shaping or maintenance was going to make them permeable at 4 feet. To comply with the new provision, I would have to remove them entirely. I read the new provision 3 times. Then I sat down and wrote the most detailed letter I had written to the HOA in 11 years of homeownership. I wrote 8 pages, single-spaced, documenting the history of my hedges, the history of the HOA's changing regulations, the notice failures, the compliance costs I had already absorbed, and my professional assessment of the new provision's intent and effect. I stated clearly that the new provision appeared designed to target established plantings like mine specifically, that it was unreasonable to apply new height and permeability requirements retroactively to plantings that had been installed in good faith and maintained in compliance with the rules as they existed at the time of installation, and that I was requesting a grandfather exemption for my existing plantings while committing to comply with the new standard for any future vegetation. I sent the letter to the HOA management company, to the HOA board, and I hand-delivered a copy to Patricia's door. I received a response 3 weeks later. It said that grandfather exemptions were not available under the current guidelines and that I had 60 days to bring my vegetation into compliance with the new provision. I consulted an attorney. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she specialized in HOA law, which is its own particular specialty for good reason. Helen reviewed my documentation and the HOA's amendment history and told me that while the new provision was aggressive and arguably targeted, it was technically within the HOA's authority to set vegetation standards, and that fighting it directly would be expensive and uncertain. She said my best option was to comply while simultaneously working to change the rule through the HOA's own democratic process, attending meetings, recruiting other homeowners, building a coalition to push back on the amendment. I asked her how long that would take. She said at least a year, probably longer. I asked her what my options were if I chose not to comply. She said fines, escalating fines, and eventually a lien on my property. I asked her if there was any way to protect my investment in the Hedges while the political process played out. She said she would think about it and get back to me. While Helen was thinking, I was also thinking. I was thinking about 11 years of work. I was thinking about 68 trees that I had planted with my own hands and maintained through every season for more than a decade. I was thinking about what it meant that every time my hedges had grown into something worth having, a new rule had appeared to cut them back. I was thinking about whether I was going to spend another 2 years trimming and complying and attending meetings only to receive another amendment that started the whole cycle over again. I was still thinking when I left for a 3-day professional conference in Chicago in the second week of June. I came home on a Wednesday evening. My hedges were gone. Not trimmed, not cut back. Gone. Where 11 years of arborvitae had stood, there was a raw, stripped property line, stumps cut to within inches of the ground, root balls partially exposed, the soil churned and torn where heavy equipment had been used to remove the trees. The mulch bed was destroyed. The irrigation heads were broken. The specimen columns at my driveway entrance, the ones I had shaped for 11 years into formal architectural elements, were stumps. I stood at the edge of my driveway for a long time. Then I went inside and called Helen Marsh. It was 7 in the evening. She answered, which told me she was a good attorney. I told her what I was looking at. There was a brief silence, and then she said, "Did you receive any additional notice from the HOA beyond the 60-day compliance letter?" "No," I said. "And your 60 days were not up?" "I had 19 days left," I said. Another silence. "Daniel," she said, "stay where you are, don't touch anything. I'm going to need you to document everything, photographs, video, all of it. Get it all tonight while the light is good enough. I'll call you in the morning." I spent 2 hours photographing and videoing every inch of what had been done. I got the stumps, the torn soil, the broken irrigation, the debris pile where the removed trees had been stacked at the edge of my driveway. I got the tire tracks from whatever equipment had been used. I got the street view, showing clearly where the hedges had been and the raw exposed property line where they no longer were. I documented everything with timestamps. Then I knocked on the door of my neighbor across the street, an older man named Frank who spent a lot of time on his porch and who I knew had seen whatever had happened. Frank told me that a crew had arrived at 9 that morning with a truck, a small excavator, and a chainsaw. They had worked until about 2 in the afternoon. A woman who Frank described accurately as Patricia Holbrook had been present for part of the time, directing the crew. Frank had taken a photograph of the truck, which had a company name on the side, because he had thought the whole thing looked wrong and had wanted to have something just in case. He showed me the photograph and texted it to me. I thanked Frank. I went back inside. I sat down at my kitchen table in the dark for a while. In the morning, Helen called. Her voice had the particular quality it gets, I would learn, when she has already done 3 hours of work before breakfast. "Here is what happened," she said. "Patricia used an HOA enforcement provision that allows the HOA to remediate a violation directly and charge the cost to the homeowner if the homeowner fails to comply within the compliance window. The provision exists. It's in your HOA guidelines, Section 11, but it has a specific trigger condition. The homeowner must have received a final notice of impending remediation with a minimum of 7 days warning before the HOA takes direct action." "I didn't receive that notice," I said. "No," she said, "you did not. I checked your compliance history file. You've been keeping records, which is very good, and there is no final remediation notice, which means that even if the 60-day compliance letter was valid, the HOA's direct action was procedurally improper. They skipped a required step." "So what does that mean?" "It means," Helen said, "that what Patricia did to your property yesterday was not authorized HOA remediation. It was trespass. It was destruction of private property, and it gives us grounds for a lawsuit that goes significantly beyond anything we could have argued about the vegetation guidelines themselves." I looked out my kitchen window at the stumps where my driveway columns had been. Tell me what we are doing, I said. We're filing a complaint with the county for unpermitted demolition of established landscaping, Helen said. We're sending a demand letter to the HOA for the full replacement cost of 68 mature arborvitae trees plus the destroyed irrigation system, with prejudgment interest. We are filing a civil suit for trespass and property destruction, naming both the HOA and Patricia Holbrook individually. And we are requesting, as part of that suit, an emergency injunction preventing the HOA from taking any further action against your property pending resolution. And the vegetation guidelines, I said. We're also challenging the amendment on procedural grounds, she said. I've been looking at the notice record for that meeting, and I think there's a real argument that the amendment was not properly noticed to all homeowners. If we can void the amendment, your hedges, the new ones, when you replant, go back to being governed by the 6-foot rule you were already in compliance with. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Helen, what can I build on my property that is not vegetation? There was a brief pause. What do you mean? The vegetation guidelines restrict vegetation. Hedges, plants. What can I build structurally along my property line that the HOA vegetation guidelines do not apply to? A longer pause. Structures are governed by a different section of the guidelines, she said slowly. Section 8. Fences are permitted up to 6 feet on side and rear property lines. Front yard structures are limited to decorative walls up to 3 feet. What about structural planters? I said. Raised bed structures along the property line built from concrete that could contain vegetation but are themselves permanent structures. Helen was quiet for a moment that felt appreciative. That is an interesting question, she said. I don't see anything in your guidelines that specifically addresses structural planters as a category. They're not fences. They're not walls in the traditional sense. They would be permanent structures subject to local building code rather than the HOA vegetation guidelines. So I could build concrete planters along my entire property line, I said, and plant whatever I wanted inside them. Within building code parameters, she said, you'd need permits, but yes, theoretically. What building code parameters apply to planters? I asked. For planters specifically, not walls, not fences, but functional planters with an interior soil volume for plant growth. Local code generally classifies them as landscape structures rather than fences or walls, which means the height restrictions that apply to fences don't automatically apply. You'd want to confirm with the building department. I'm going to call the building department this afternoon, I said. Daniel, Helen said, and I could hear something in her voice that I can only describe as professional admiration mixed with mild concern. What exactly are you planning to build? The Elmwood Grove Building Department was, in my experience, one of the more functional local government offices I had ever dealt with. This is not always the case. Building departments range from the genuinely helpful to the actively obstructionist, and you never know which one you're getting until you're standing at the counter. What I got was a woman named Carol who had been working in the department for 23 years, and who, when I explained that I wanted to build concrete planter structures along my property line, asked 3 precise and intelligent questions, consulted her reference materials, and gave me a clear answer within 15 minutes. Structural planters, she confirmed, were classified under the local building code as landscape structures, not fences or retaining walls, provided certain conditions were met. They needed to have a functional planting interior with adequate soil volume and drainage. They needed to be built to standard structural specifications for concrete construction. They needed a building permit, which she could process, and an inspection at foundation and completion. There was no height limit specified for landscape structures in the municipal code, though anything over 8 feet would trigger an engineering review requirement to confirm structural integrity. I asked what the engineering review involved. She said I would need a stamped structural drawing from a licensed engineer confirming that the design was sound. I told her I was a landscape architect and had professional relationships with structural engineers. She said that would make things straightforward. I thanked Carol and left with a building permit application and a much clearer understanding of what I was going to do. Let me describe what I designed, because the design matters and I am proud of it. The structure I designed was a continuous concrete planter running along the full length of my Sycamore Lane frontage, 112 linear feet, and the full length of my Maple Court frontage, 28 linear feet, for a total of 140 linear feet, matching exactly the original footprint of my hedge installation. The planter was designed with a base width of 36 inches at the bottom, tapering to 24 inches at the top, with an interior planting cavity of 18 inches wide and 36 inches deep, filled with high-quality growing medium over a crushed stone drainage layer. The exterior face was board-formed concrete, a technique where the concrete is poured against wooden boards that leave a textured impression, creating a surface that looks both natural and architectural. The top of the planter was capped with a poured concrete surface, slightly sloped for water runoff, with an integrated drip irrigation system. The height of the planter structure itself was 42 inches, 3.5 feet of solid concrete. But I was not planting the same arbor vitae in it. The trees I selected for the new installation were columnar English oaks, a variety called fastigiata that grows in a narrow, upright column reaching 25 to 30 feet at maturity, with a canopy spread of only 4 to 6 feet even at full size. They are not a hedge plant in the traditional sense. They are trees, individual trees spaced in the planters at 10-foot intervals, each one a distinct structural element. They are, at maturity, an absolute wall of green, denser in summer, skeletal and dramatic in winter, and they are entirely governed by a different section of the HOA guidelines than the vegetation restrictions that Patricia had been using against me, because they were trees, not hedges, and the HOA guidelines had different provisions for trees than for what they called front yard vegetation boundaries. I reviewed those provisions carefully with Helen before I finalized the design. The guidelines permitted ornamental trees in front yards up to any height, provided they did not constitute a continuous impermeable screen. Columnar oaks planted at 10-foot intervals did not constitute a continuous impermeable screen. They were individual trees. That they happened to be planted in a straight line and would eventually form a visually unified element was a matter of aesthetics, not regulation. The concrete planters themselves were not addressed in the vegetation guidelines at all because they were not vegetation. They were structures subject to the building permit I had already applied for. I called my structural engineer, a man named Phil Donovan with whom I had worked on several professional projects, and explained what I needed. Phil drew the structural specifications in about 4 days. He said the design was conservative enough that he could stamp it without extensive calculation work, and I filed the permit application with Carol at the building department. The permit was approved in 11 days. I arranged for a contractor I had worked with professionally, a concrete specialist named Eduardo, whose crew had done structural work on several of my landscape architecture projects and who understood the board form technique I wanted. Eduardo looked at the design, walked the property, and gave me a cost estimate that I will not share publicly, except to say it was significant, and I paid it without hesitation, because the alternative was accepting what Patricia had done to my property and continuing to live under her arbitrary authority, and that was not something I was willing to do. While all of this was being arranged, Helen was simultaneously pursuing the legal case. Within 2 weeks of my hedges being destroyed, she had filed the civil suit, sent the demand letter, and obtained the emergency injunction preventing further HOA action against my property. The injunction hearing had been brief. Patricia's attorney had argued that the HOA's remediation was authorized under Section 11 of the guidelines. Helen had produced documentation showing that the required final notice had not been sent, and the judge had granted the injunction within about 40 minutes of the hearing starting. Patricia had been in the courtroom for the injunction hearing. I had seen her across the room. She had the posture of someone trying very hard to appear unconcerned. I had not looked at her for long. I had a contractor to coordinate with and a building permit to manage, and not enough hours in the day. Construction began on a Monday morning 5 weeks after I came home to find my hedges gone. Eduardo arrived at 7 a.m. with his crew, a concrete mixer truck, and a trailer of form materials. I had taken the week off work to be present because I wanted to see every part of this go into the ground. The first day was excavation and form setting. Eduardo's crew dug the continuous footing along both property line frontages, set the forms, and prepared the drainage layer. It was a full day of hard physical work, and by the end of it, there was a network of form boards running along my entire front property perimeter, defining the shape of what was coming. I will tell you honestly that Patricia walked past my property twice that day. I saw her. She lived 3 doors down and had no particular reason to walk in that direction. She always drove, so the walks were deliberate. The first time she slowed at the edge of my driveway and looked at the forms for a long time before continuing. The second time she stopped completely and stood there watching Eduardo's crew work. I was standing in my yard, watching the same thing, and we made eye contact at one point. I gave her a small, completely genuine smile, not a mean smile, just the acknowledgement of a man who is having a very good day, and she walked away. Concrete pour happened on day 3. It is one of the most satisfying things in construction to watch, the wet concrete coming out of the truck, being worked into the forms, settled and leveled by people who know exactly what they're doing. Eduardo's crew poured the full 140 linear feet in a single day. They were still working when the lights started going, finishing the cap pour and setting the drainage ports, but when they were done, the structure was continuous, solid, permanent. The forms came off on day 5. I was there when Eduardo's crew stripped the first section of board form, and I watched the concrete surface come into view, the textured impression of the boards in the grey concrete, the clean geometric line of the cap, the slight sheen of the fresh surface in the morning light. It looked exactly like what I had designed, not a fence, not a wall, a planter, obviously and functionally a planter with the planting cavity visible across the top, but a planter that was 36 inches at its base, 42 inches tall, and ran continuously along every inch of my street-facing property line. A structure that weighed, by my estimate, somewhere in the range of 40 tons. A structure that nothing short of heavy demolition equipment was ever going to move. The building inspection happened on day 7. The inspector, a man named Gerald who arrived with a clipboard and a matter-of-fact manner, walked the full perimeter, checked the drainage, measured several points on the structure, reviewed Eduardo's construction documentation, and signed off the permit. He said on his way out that it was a clean install. I thanked him. The columnar English oaks were delivered the following week. I had sourced 15-gallon specimens, not the largest available, but large enough to have visible structure immediately, from a specialty nursery that I had worked with professionally and who could provide the specific columnar form I needed. 14 trees along Sycamore Lane, 4 along Maple Court, 2 taller specimens flanking the driveway entrance. I planted them myself, which took 2 full days. Each one went into the planting cavity with amended growing medium, a mycorrhizal inoculant to establish the root system, slow-release fertilizer, and a connection to the integrated drip irrigation line. When the last tree was in, I stood back on the sidewalk and looked at what was there. It was not yet what it was going to become. The oaks were young, 3, maybe 4 feet of visible canopy above the concrete cap, upright and columnar, and distinctly tree-shaped. In 5 years, they would be 8 feet above the cap. In 10 years, 15. In 20 years, if I was still in this house and taking care of them the way I intended to, they would be a row of 25-foot columns rising from a continuous concrete planter, the most architecturally distinctive residential streetscape feature in the neighborhood, possibly in the county. But even now, 3 weeks after construction and planting was complete, it already looked like something. It already looked intentional and permanent and serious in a way that no one walking past could fail to register. Helen called me the day after I finished planting. She had an update on the legal case. The demand letter we had sent to the HOA for the replacement cost of my hedges, which Helen had calculated based on professional appraisal of mature arborvitae trees at 11 years of growth, the destroyed irrigation system, and the landscape remediation cost had been received. The HOA's attorney had responded. They wanted to negotiate. Helen told me what their opening position was. I told her what my position was. She said she thought we could get there. She also told me that the challenge to the vegetation amendment on procedural grounds was looking strong. She had obtained the HOA's meeting notice records through discovery, and the notice for the meeting at which the amendment had been passed had not been sent to 7 homeowners on the street, including me. This was not a minor oversight. Under the HOA's own bylaws, an amendment required notice to all homeowners of record at least 15 days before the meeting. 7 homeowners not receiving notice voided the procedural validity of the vote. If the amendment was voided, the vegetation guidelines reverted to the previous version, the 6-foot rule, and my concrete planters, even with oaks that would eventually exceed 6 feet, were not governed by the vegetation guidelines. They were structural installation with a valid building permit. Whatever grew in them was, at that point, a matter between me and the trees. I asked Helen to push for the amendment void as a condition of any settlement. She said she had already planned to. The settlement negotiation took about 3 months. The HOA's insurance carrier got involved, which is usually a sign that things are moving toward resolution. What we eventually reached was a written agreement that included the following. The HOA would pay me the full replacement cost of my hedges as calculated by the professional appraisal, plus the irrigation system cost, plus my attorney fees incurred in connection with the unauthorized remediation. The HOA would issue a formal written apology acknowledging that the remediation action had not followed proper procedure. The vegetation amendment was declared void on procedural grounds and removed from the guidelines, and the HOA agreed to a new provision in their bylaws requiring that any amendment to the community guidelines receive written notice sent via certified mail to every homeowner of record at least 21 days before any vote, with proof of delivery required before the vote could be held. That last provision was not something they offered. That was something I insisted on because I had watched Patricia amend the guidelines repeatedly with the minimum possible notice to the homeowners most affected, and I was not going to settle for a resolution that left the door open for the same process to happen to someone else. They agreed to it after some back and forth. I received the settlement payment 6 months after the day I came home to find my hedges gone. I used a portion of it to fund the irrigation system upgrade I had been planning, and a portion to add accent lighting to the concrete planters, low-voltage uplighting installed in the soil between the oaks, wired through the planter structure, powered by a small solar installation on the roof. At night, the effect was something I had imagined, but hadn't been certain would work as well as it did. The trees caught the light from below. The textured concrete surface glowed softly in the warmth of the LED fixtures, and the whole thing had a quality that I can only describe as genuinely architectural. It looked like something you would see in a designed public space, a park, a civic building, a botanical garden, not in a residential front yard in Elmwood Grove. But there it was. Patricia Holbrook did not complete her term as HOA president. I don't know all the details of what happened internally. I wasn't in those conversations, and I didn't have the energy to follow the neighborhood gossip closely enough to reconstruct it. What I know is that approximately 5 months after the settlement, the HOA held a special meeting and elected a new president, a man named Carl who was an accountant and whose primary stated goal as HOA president was to not be involved in any lawsuits. Carl sent me a brief and pleasant email introducing himself and confirming that he had reviewed my file and considered the matter fully resolved. I sent him a brief and pleasant response, welcoming him to the role and expressing my hope that we could have a straightforward neighborly relationship going forward. I meant it. I do not enjoy conflict. I did not build the concrete planters out of aggression or spite. I built them because they were the right solution, structurally permanent, legally unassailable, beautiful in their own right, and completely immune to the kind of arbitrary rule changes that had cost me 11 years of hedge work. I built them because when someone destroys something you made with your own hands, the response that means something is not complaint or argument. The response that means something is to build something better, something they cannot touch, and then to stand in front of it and be completely, permanently right. The oaks are growing. They grow fast in good soil with consistent water, which is what they have in the planters. Last summer, the first full growing season after planting, they put on nearly 2 feet of new growth each. The columnar form is holding exactly as the variety promises. They are already, even at 3 years in, starting to have the quality I was imagining when I ordered them, the upright formality, the layered texture of the oak foliage, the way they hold their shape through wind and weather. In the mornings, when I back out of my driveway, I look at the planters along the street. The concrete has weathered slightly in the time since construction, taking on the particular character that concrete develops when it has been through a few seasons of rain and temperature, slightly darker in some patches, the board form texture more visible, the cap edge softened a little from foot traffic. It looks like it has always been there. It looks settled, permanent, inevitable. Patricia's house is 3 doors down. I pass it every time I drive in or out of the neighborhood. I don't know whether she still watches the planters when she drives past. I don't spend much time thinking about what she watches or what she thinks. I think about the oaks. I think about how tall they'll be in 10 years. I think about the fact that they are growing in 40 tons of concrete that no one is ever going to move without a demolition permit and a very large machine, and that every year they grow they become more themselves, more unmistakably what I planted them to be, and that the longer they stand there, the more obviously, visibly, permanently correct my decision to build what I built becomes. My grandfather used to say that the best revenge is a long life well lived. I think about that when I look at the planters. I'm not sure what I built is revenge exactly. It is more like a statement made in concrete and oak and time, a statement that says some things cannot be taken from a person simply because someone in a position of nominal authority decides they should be. Some things, when you build them right, when you plant them deep and give them water and tend them through the seasons, become more than what they were. They become evidence. They become proof. They become, if you are patient enough and build carefully enough, something that outlasts every person who ever tried to tell you it shouldn't be there. I drove past the planters last week on my way home from work. It was a good evening, the light was low and warm, and the oaks were catching it from the west, and I pulled over for a moment and just looked at them from across the street, the way I used to look at the hedges. They looked good. They looked like they were going to be great. I drove home and made dinner and sat on my back porch and listened to the neighborhood settle into the evening, and I felt, as I have felt every day since the concrete went in and the oaks went down into the soil, the particular satisfaction of a man who built something right. Thumbnail text. Line 1, HOA Karen destroyed my hedges while I was gone, so I built 40 tons of concrete she can never touch. Line 2, now my lawyers own her HOA, and my fortress grows taller every year deciduous locked.